we were obliged, and we did change the international law.
Yeah. As one of the architects of humanitarian intervention, what would you say to those people, especially in the developing world, in the global south, who say that in practice, this so-called right to interfere, to intervene, is only ever exercised by Western powers, by people in the north? Developing countries don't get to go around intervening in developed countries. It seems to be one-way traffic.
This is not completely untrue, but who is supposed to protect the people? The people able to do so? The people involved? I mean, let's say the Good Samaritans?
Let me read to you a quote from David Reef, who used to be a big supporter of humanitarian intervention like yourself, but then became very disillusioned with the whole idea. And he wrote a few years ago, quote, "When a British or French minister proposes a UN resolution calling for a military intervention to make sure aid is properly delivered in New Orleans, then and only then can we be sure to have put the spectre of imperialism dressed up as humanitarianism behind us." He's got a point, hasn't he?
My opinion, if I may.
This show is all about your opinions.
Maybe. There is no imperialist victim and non-imperialist victim among the civilian population. There are no bad victims and good victims. There are no bad dying people and good dying people.
But there are countries who have an imperialist agenda, some would argue, and hiding behind humanitarian laws.
I defend the victims. I'm always on the victims' side.
In France, for example, your country. Very proud nationalistic country, great legacy in history.
What about UK? Are you coming from UK?
Indeed, the UK is as well, but I'm not interviewing the former British Foreign Minister tonight.
They are all nationalists in that time.
Agreed, agreed. But given we're talking about France and you're French, let me put this question to you.
But I'm answering to you because you are
of course,
British citizen.
And I'm British,
so
and I'm British. And if you read my stuff, I'm no fan of British government foreign policy.
I'm very happy to that sort of exchange,
Let me get the question out. In 2017,
yes,
if Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Front, is elected president of France and starts persecuting French Jews, French Algerians, French Moroccans, would Israel or Algeria or Morocco have a right to intervene in France to protect those minorities?
I think that it will not be necessary. We'll protect the Jewish ourselves.
Okay. But if it wasn't happening, you would accept that an outside country could come into France to protect your minority population?
It was exactly the case during the Algerian war. Unfortunately, we had to go to war during 8 years, very bloody war, and we were wrong.
Okay, well we're going to try and run through lots of conflicts in brief time.
Yes.
Would it have been easier, as some argue now, to have intervened in the conflict in Syria today had Iraq not happened?
Unfortunately, we did not. Unfortunately, I was strongly in favor at the beginning, because now it is a bit difficult. All the actors has changed position and political involvement. But at the beginning, I think, and I proposed that it was possible to avoid the bombing of the civilian population. Was it better with Bashar al-Assad oppressing freedom, in fact, and arresting the people, violation of human rights, etc.? Do we have to stood on his side or not? I think we had to say that it was a dictator and nothing else. I'm on the Syrian people's side. Of course, all the millions of refugees, they are waiting for peace. How can we, let's say, impose peace? This is very difficult. And not this is the only difficult, but they are supported by Russia, by Chinese and other Arabic countries. But better to stop the war, of course. How to stop the war? Do you have a recipe? No, neither me.
Okay. Well, on that note, let me bring in our panel who are with us tonight from across the spectrum. Lindsay German is an anti-war activist, president, or one of the people who runs Britain's Stop the War Coalition. Lindsay, you've opposed a fair few wars in your time, but surely you would accept the principle that in some cases where a massacre is happening, or about to happen, there is a principled case for people who have the means to stop that massacre to go in and do it, to hell with international law.
I don't accept it at all, and the reason I don't accept it is because we have a long history now of so-called humanitarian intervention, which has led to more people being killed, has led to more devastation. We've seen Libya, which is a complete disaster area now. Places like Afghanistan are still racked with all sorts of problems that they had.
Intervention almost always makes things
Yes,
worse.
and we're always told it's to go in to stop a massacre. In reality, when you look at the events that take place, it is not to do that. That wasn't what Afghanistan was about. It wasn't what Libya was about. It wasn't what Iraq was about. So I am against this.
Are you saying that humanitarian is a cover?
It is a cover, and it's interesting. You've been having the discussion with Bernard about exactly where and who intervenes, and it is the major powers. It's about certain countries and certain rulers who aren't liked by the Western powers.
Okay, well, on that note, let me bring in Barak Sina, who's an associate fellow at the defence think tank, the Royal United Services Institute in London. You are a supporter of the principle of intervention and military intervention, but surely you would accept Lindsay's point that it's not always about humanitarian goals, is it? Sometimes it's about good old-fashioned geopolitical interests. And we use the language of humanitarianism as a bit of a cover.
If you're going to look around the globe to see the different crises or ethnic cleansing, genocide that are taking place, there has to be three pillars that will guide your foreign policy. There has to be capacity of resources, there has to be your ideals, and there has to be your security interests / economic interests. If there's an issue of nuclear proliferation, if there's an absence of governance, that's the #1 thing on any national security strategy. You've got to go in. You have to have a degree of military intervention. You can't ignore it.
But when a Western leader, quote, a French leader, a British leader, an American leader says, we're going in to save the people, do you believe them? A lot of people say, we don't believe you.
I think that there's going to be a degree of that being motive, because it's precisely a country which is a failed state that is likely to be a sponsor of terrorism, but also abuse its domestic infrastructure, to abuse its own citizens.
Let me bring in Hamza Hamouchein, is a human rights activist, chair of the Algeria Solidarity Campaign. Hamza, in a country like Syria, where tens of thousands of innocent people have been killed, some of them by chemical weapons, how long can you do nothing militarily if you have the means to set up a no-fly zone or arm rebels with better arms?
Looking simply at history will tell us that the Western powers intervene when their interests are endangered, intervene to maintain their domination and expand their influence. How can we believe that these Western powers intervene for the sake of the people when they support other atrocities and crimes like the state of Israel?
Let's put that point to Bernard Kouchner. Rhetoric is easy, but how can we trust the intentions of the same people who back dictators and tyrants elsewhere while claiming to protect people in this part of the world?
But I'm not pretending that we are civilizing the world. I pretend very clearly that this is better to save one life than not to do anything. If you cannot understand that, sorry for you. If it is your cousin, your brother, your mother, you will ask me to intervene.
Lindsay German, very briefly.
You're confusing two different things.
Sorry?
You're talking about your role as a doctor and people's role as a doctor. That is quite different from what people in government are doing.
The Hippocratic Oath surely says, first do no harm.
No, certainly not. The Hippocratic Oath, it was the argument against us. This is a relation, a very particular relation between one patient and one doctor. Not the mass massacre, not the genocide, not the big killers.
The problem with these wars that we're talking about is innocent people die in them. Lindsay's point is that when you go in to prevent a massacre, often other massacres happen, sometimes at our hands.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's not that easy,
That is not a reason not to stop. Because
it is a reason if you end up doing more harm than good.
Simplicity is not always wrongness. I'm explaining you why we wanted to protect the people before the killing. Because this is easy to say, I'm here to take care of the patient. If they are dead, the patients, this is not enough.
France, Britain, and the US armed the rebels in Syria and escalated the war.
You're mistaking.
If you're really interested
hold on,
in
let him come back in.
We are not arming the rebels. We wanted to arm at the beginning, and we were unsuccessful. We wanted to arm the Democrats against the dictator. It was simplistic, but it was true. Unfortunately, they have been replaced by terrorists and killers.
You mentioned earlier, just a moment ago, you mentioned that you would like to prevent a massacre before it happens.
I'm with. Yes.
Libya is a classic example cited by people who say that
yes.
by going into Libya in 2011, the French led the charge alongside the UK and the US.
Yes.
We went in to avert a massacre in Benghazi,
That's true.
and that was a humanitarian intervention. The problem is, of course, it then turned into regime change. Gaddafi was toppled. French and British special forces were calling in airstrikes. Our air forces were basically acting as rebel air forces. The UN resolution said simply protect civilians, but we went all the way to Tripoli and took out Gaddafi, who was then pretty brutally killed. How can you say it's a humanitarian intervention looking back now, given it didn't stick to the strict parameters of protecting Benghazi?
At the beginning, it was something to protect the citizen of Benghazi, and it was right. But I'm sorry, there is some rules. You cannot just eat and leave. And certainly we had to protect the people. You have to be, let's say, human rights fighter by advance. To protect human rights is a long, long story, and this is difficult when you are marked up.
Are you really saying that you didn't, you
Yes.
went into Libya
No,
to protect
we did not.
Benghazi, and we just got carried away and ended up in Tripoli?
Yes.
Really?
No. No, but we did.
You
That's
didn't go
exactly
in to
what
topple
we did.
Gaddafi. That wasn't the original intent.
No, certainly not. It was not. We came in the name of the Security Council, and we overrun the...
And many of those Security Council members say you violated Resolution 1973 by going all the way to
That's not
Tripoli.
completely untrue.
Okay.
But at the beginning,
I
we
do love
came...
that phrase. That's a new one for me. Not completely untrue. Post-Gaddafi Libya, something else that's
You
not...
have to be used, because I will use it several times.
Please do, please do. Let me use it. What's not completely untrue also is that post-Gaddafi Libya isn't the greatest of places to live today.
Not only it was not completely true, but it was right.
Okay, so you open Pandora's box and you walk away, and you say you're still on the side of the victim.
Yes, a bit. Yes.
Okay.
But sorry to be in agreement with you.
No. I'm glad you're in agreement with me. I'm glad you
thank you very
accept
much.
what went wrong. Just very quickly, before we move on from Gaddafi, he was a vile dictator for many years. And yet, 4 years before France decided to take him out, he was in Paris on a state visit. He was doing sightseeing at Versailles. He had pitched his tent next to the Élysée Palace. You were the French foreign minister.
Sir, that I refuse.
But your government invited him. You can't wash your hands of what your
I told Sarkozy, I'm not with you on that
Why didn't you
invitation, and
you-
I refused to
As
meet
someone
with
who's always
Gaddafi.
on the side of the victims, why didn't you resign from a government which invited Gaddafi to Paris and called him brother leader? Why didn't you resign and say, this is outrageous?
That was a contradiction in politics, yes.
Okay, well, let's bring in Lindsay German, who was a... Do you want to respond to the point Bernard made, that you're on the, as a pacifist, you're on the side of people like Gaddafi,
I'm not a
effectively?
pacifist, and I don't always take the view that wars are wrong. But I think that the wars that have involved the United States, Britain, and France latterly, particularly with Libya, I think have done tremendous damage to the world. I think the world is a much more dangerous place than it was in 2001. People talk about the threat of terrorism. There is now the threat of terrorism across large parts of Africa, large parts of the Middle East.
Do you accept that had France and Britain not intervened in 2011, innocent people would have died in Benghazi at Gaddafi's
That
hands?
may well be the case, but innocent people have been dying this year because the country is divided, the country is in a form of civil war, there is no government,
But it
and the
existed
situation
already.
is certainly not better. And I think the real question here, Hamza touched on it, is does France and Britain and the United States, do they have the right to tell other countries what to do? And you cannot simply talk about this as if it's just doctors going across borders.
Let me bring
that isn't what it's about.
Let me bring in Barack
But
Sina
it was a military intervention in order that the British and the French fighters, I mean the planes,
let's hear
just
from
avoid the killing of the people, but it was a military intervention.
Okay, let me bring in, hold on, let me bring in Barack
Yes,
Sina,
but
who's
without
waiting very
any
patiently.
humanitarian involvement. Any.